What's up, everybody? Welcome back to PD Sean Studios. I'm Sean. I'm a painter and artist in Montgomery, Alabama. And in this video, I'm going to be doing a cheap versus expensive brand video. That's where I take two paint brands, put them up against each other, and see which one I like better. So in this video, I'll be doing Fine Touch acrylics versus Blick acrylics. Fine Touch is our cheaper paint, which is what I'll be using on the first two paintings, and we'll judge these based on the same categories as my last cheap versus expensive video. Then at the end of the video, I'll let you know how these stack up to each other. For these paintings, I want to do something winter related. We just got through the holidays and painting winter landscapes are pretty quick and easy projects. So for the first one, I'll do a Christmas tree, then I'll do some normal landscapes after that. Fine Touch is a softer, smoother brand of paint, so it's spreading pretty easily on the canvas, but because of that, it's taking longer to dry. And since I'm an impatient painter, I'm inadvertently blending the paint in certain sections where I'm not intending to. With the texture, I'm having a little bit of an issue with Fine Touch because in sections where I'm layering the paint where I want more texture, as it dries, it seems like it's dissipating and flattening. And as this paint dries, it seems like the pigment is getting a little flatter and kind of dull. So because this is a softer paint, like I mentioned before, it does blend really well on the canvas. So I'm able to do a soft gradient for the skyline and for the snow. As I work on the trees, I can use a hair dryer so that it dries better and I don't inadvertently blend my paints. Because this paint is softer, I don't have to use very many mediums or thinner, which means the opacity is really good when I work in layers. So I've worked on two paintings with the Fine Touch acrylics, and now it's time to move on to the Blick acrylic paints. The first thing I noticed from these Blick acrylics is the amount of different paints that I have in this set. So color mixing will be pretty easy since I don't have to just use the primary colors. On this first painting with the Blick acrylics, I'm going to put down a base layer of white so I can see how well these paints blend together. Then I'll use purples, reds, and blues to create a gradient that makes this look like a sunset. And then we'll throw in some Bob Ross mountains in the background. Honestly, I'm pretty impressed with the color mixing of these Blick paints. The paint's pretty thick out of the bottle, but when you use medium to thin them down, they blend really well together. So it's easy to mix and find the color that you want to work with. The pigment is really nice on these paints. As it dries, it stays rich and vibrant, which means the color that you have on your palette is what you're going to end up with after this painting dries. I also really like the texture of these paints. I'm able to get great texture. I can leave them a little bit thicker for the texture that I want, or I can thin them down to get a thinner coverage. So now we have the first Blick painting signed and done, and we can move on to our last painting. For this last painting, I want to do something a little different. I'm going to use a Master's Touch Grandeur Collection canvas, so it's a little bit thicker and the canvas is bigger. On the other paintings, I did a nighttime or sunset, so on this one, I wanted a daytime painting. So I'll be using a lot of ultramarine blue and whites in order to get our skyline, and the opacity of this paint is kind of low, and that's because it's a thicker paint, so I have to thin it down with mediums in areas that I don't want a lot of texture. On this painting, I'll primarily be looking at the opacity and viscosity since the last painting gave me a really good idea of where we are with our categories. So now that I know those last two elements, I can kind of play with this last painting a little bit. I want to add my own style and do some weird characters, so I'm going to sketch out this Titan character fighting a snowman, which I think would be kind of funny and would look really cool. So let's sketch those out and then transfer them onto the canvas. I've got the transfer done, so now I just need to get these guys painted. Now here's a closer look at the last painting. Alright, we talked about how these paints stack up while we were painting, but here's the breakdown. First up is color mixing. Both of these paints were pretty easy to get the color that I wanted to work with, and both of them come with a wide variety in their basic sets. So for this category, I'm gonna have to call it a tie. Next up, we're gonna talk about texture. Fine Touch gave me a lot of issues with texture because after it dried, that texture would dissipate. Whereas Blick acrylics, those held up after drying. So it was really easy to get the texture that I wanted from the Blick acrylics. With Fine Touch, you have to go back layer after layer, which is wasting a lot of time and material. So for this category, I have to give it to Blick. Then there's opacity. The Fine Touch doesn't take as many coats to cover the same area, and if you're trying to layer your colors to work on shading, you can reduce the opacity by mixing in a medium. With the Blick acrylics, you do get a good opacity, but you have to minimize the amount of medium that you use, which can result in unwanted texture. So I've got to give this category to Fine Touch. Now we'll talk about pigment. Blick paints have a much richer saturation, especially after they dry. Fine Touch, it has a flatter matte finish, which some people like with their paints, but I prefer a much richer, glossier finish on my paintings. So for that reason, I'm gonna give this category to Blick. Moving on, we have viscosity, which is a tough category because most artists will manipulate their paints while using them. But straight out of the tube, Blick paints are a thicker paint, which means you can get better texture with it, or you can thin it down for better shading. Whereas Fine Touch, it's a softer paint straight out of the tube, which means it only gets thinner. So for that reason, I'm gonna give this category to Blick. And the last category is cost, which turned out to be more difficult than I expected because Fine Touch is the less expensive paint straight off the shelf, but if you use a medium with Blick acrylics, it'll actually stretch just as far or farther than the Fine Touch. So I've got to give this a tie because it really depends on how you use your paints. If you're using a medium, then Blick stretches farther and becomes the less expensive paint. So overall, putting all of these categories together, in my opinion, Blick is the better paint. I really do enjoy this comparison series and I hope you've enjoyed watching it. If you've got a paint brand that you want to see me try next, leave it below in the comments, let me know what you think. I also want to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. You guys are absolutely amazing. If you want to help contribute to the studio and get some really cool stuff while you do, go to patreon.com/pdshawn. Also, check out my website where all of my artwork's available and it ships anywhere for free. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment below to let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys next time.